across Ukraine. Ukraine cannot be expected to accept terms that amount to its full capitulation and subjugation. Let there be no doubt, these demands are completely unacceptable. They are simply distraction, smokescreens to buy time and continue the killing. Mr. President, in closing, it is now high time for Russia to come to the negotiation table to engage seriously. As a start, Denmark calls for an immediate 30-day ceasefire. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine until a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter is achieved. Ukraine must be free to decide its own future. There must be accountability for the terrible and widespread suffering its people have endured. We cannot and we will not remain silent.
And going beyond, how do we expand it further? Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your support. I thank Rajesh ji for excellent support in using AI for I4C. AI in itself may not mean much, but when it is applied to various sectors, it can really make a big difference in solving problems at the population scale, problems at a large scale. So thank you, Rajesh ji, for being such a good part of the team. Abhishek has been driving the mission so well. Kavita ji, Abhishek, thank you so much for your energy. And thank you so much, all the friends who have been part of this journey throughout this last almost 1.5 years now. In 1.5 years, we have made significant progress. The focus, as all of us know, is our Prime Minister's very clear vision of democratizing technology.
Only Russia is impeding this process. 1 month ago, in this very chamber,
Ukraine cannot be
with
expected
the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, Jean-Noël Barrot, present, all members of the Security Council, except Russia, called for an end to hostilities. Ukraine recalled that starting from the 11th of March, it had been ready to accept an immediate, complete and unconditional ceasefire. What's happened since then? Ukraine reaffirmed that it was ready to end hostilities. The Ukrainians have been saying this across the board, including at the highest political level. President Zelensky reiterated in Kiev on the 10th of May this very fact, together with the leaders of Germany, France, Poland and the UK. Once again, the Russian president dodged the issue. Once again, he refused to end his attacks. To divert attention and to deliberately prolong the carnage, he called for direct negotiations in Istanbul, which he did not attend. President Zelensky was there, in Turkey, waiting for President Putin. Everyone knows this. In response to ceasefire proposals, the Russian Federation did not respond with a willingness to partake in real peace negotiations. Russia's vague engagements made to continue discussions. Whereas from Ukraine, in Ukraine, we saw on Russia's part contempt for the fate of civilians and human lives, with the deliberate targeting of civilian objects in violation of IHL, a record number of missiles and combat drones, as well as unabashed inflexibility on the part of the Kremlin as it pursued its objectives at a time when war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed, as documented by the recent report of the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. President, let's hone in on the adjective unconditional, because it's vital for this Council to have a common understanding of what that means, a common definition. What does that mean, an unconditional ceasefire? This entails, and in fact, Ukraine has shown itself to be willing to do so since the 11th of March, it entails stopping the hostilities immediately, without any conditions. It is not the way Russia sees it, that is, a possible end to hostilities with an unspecified time frame, which hinges on a peace agreement being signed that's tantamount to a capitulation on the part of the attacked party. What does it mean, starting unconditional peace talks? It means accepting to participate in discussions which are not subject to any conditions. This is what Ukraine has been doing and did in Istanbul on the 16th of May, accepting direct negotiations with Russia without any prerequisites for a ceasefire. It's not about setting maximalist conditions. Yet this is how the Russian Federation interpreted this in Istanbul on the 16th of May, when Russia demanded for Ukraine to withdraw its troops from the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Let me repeat, on the 12th of October 2022, the General Assembly of the United Nations condemned the so-called, and I quote, attempted illegal annexation of the aforementioned territories by the Russian Federation. President, France stands ready, shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and its partners, ready to initiate in a virtuous process of discussions about a peace plan. France stands side by side with the Ukrainian people to provide it with the humanitarian assistance it needs. The Russian Federation has no credibility when it claims to negotiate in good faith, all the while intensifying its strikes on Ukrainian territory. For this reason, the Security Council must demand a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire.
Non. La démilitarisation de l'Ukraine n'est pas une condition préalable, ni un objectif des pourparlers de paix.
Prerequisite, nor is it an objective of the peace talks. No. The aggressor cannot demand for the attacked party to renounce its right to self-defense conferred upon it by the United Nations Charter as a prerequisite for the aggressor putting an end to the aggression. Just, robust and lasting peace, as called for on multiple occasions by the General Assembly, will entail robust and credible security guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine should be able to choose its future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Doughton for briefing us today. Colleagues, we convene today to address the situation in Ukraine as we collectively mourn the lives lost due to Russia's recent attacks. This weekend saw two of the largest mass air attacks of the war, back to back. Over 3 days, Russia launched over 900 drones and missiles at Ukrainian cities, reportedly resulting in the deaths of 30 people and injuring a further 150. And these deaths were not an accident. Russia's missile and drone strikes struck major urban centres and densely populated regions. Over the night of 24 May, among those killed were 3 children, specifically 3 siblings. Stanislav, aged 8, Tamara, aged 12, and Roman, aged 17. Each of them on the edge of a new chapter of childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. All of them robbed of life too soon. Such acts are a stark reminder of the urgent need to bring this war to an end. Russia's attacks are not only sustained, they are worsening. As OHCHR has verified, in the first 3 months of this year alone, there have been 2,641 civilian casualties. That's nearly 900 more than during the same period in 2024, and over 600 more than early 2023. The increased killing of civilians is an affront to our shared values of human dignity and peace. Values which President Putin claims to share, yet continues to violate. Putin's priorities are demonstrated by his timing. These attacks were launched days after talks in Istanbul, in which Russia, yet again, refused to agree to an unconditional ceasefire. Presented with another opportunity for meaningful progress towards peace, Putin chose war. President, while Ukraine stands ready for an unconditional ceasefire, Russia sustains its aggression. And once again, innocent civilians are paying the price. Russia's actions speak much louder than its words. So we call on Russia to comply with international law, including the UN Charter, and to stop the killing of innocent civilians. Russia's unrelenting invasion of its sovereign neighbour will only redouble our resolve to help Ukraine defend itself and to use the necessary measures to restrict Putin's war machine. We will work in unison with the US, Ukraine, our European and international partners, until a just and lasting peace is no longer an aim, but an enduring reality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you also for convening this meeting that Slovenia called for with other members of the Council from Europe. Mr. President, I would also like to thank the briefers and the Secretary General De Carlo and Director Doughton. We need an end to the fighting in Ukraine, an end to civilian death, displacement, and deportation of children, an end to destruction of schools, hospitals, and houses. With hopes for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Slovenia continues to support the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Meanwhile, however, Ukraine and its population are enduring a relentless barrage of aerial attacks. As we just heard from Under-Secretary General De Carlo, last weekend Russia launched a wave of large-scale airstrikes, hundreds of drones and missiles raining down on Ukrainian cities in the overnight attacks. The airstrikes on May 26 were the single largest aerial attack since the war began. I know other colleagues have said that before, but I think it's always good to repeat the largest attack since the war began, with no other apparent aim than to cause destruction of civilian infrastructure and install fear and terror in civilian population. All of this happened just before the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry concluded that the drone attacks by Russian armed forces around Kherson last year amount to crimes against humanity of murder. Slovenia condemns these attacks in the strongest possible terms. They represent a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. These attacks seem to represent nothing else but a big country, an aggressor, flexing its muscles over its smaller neighbor. Display of bad faith amidst of diplomatic efforts. Mr. President, with death and destruction on the rise, the need for diplomacy is obvious. Slovenia welcomes all contacts between Ukraine and Russia, like the Istanbul peace talks in the mid-May. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. We underline, however, that the overall outcome is underwhelming. Russia has been claiming it wants peace for a very long time, but its actions speak otherwise. It has torpedoed all efforts towards stopping the fighting. It met Ukrainians' efforts towards a full ceasefire only with demands and conditions. To any onlooker, the situation is obvious. Ukraine is ready to silence the guns. Russia is not. Mr. President, we need a lasting and verifiable ceasefire that can pave the way to negotiations on enduring peace in Ukraine. With this in mind, Slovenia calls on Russia to stop hesitating and agree to a full and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine and entire Europe want and need peace, not war, but peace. A peace that lasts and a peace that is just, a peace that is firmly anchored in the UN Charter and its principles. It is our duty to provide Ukraine with an opportunity to achieve it. Only this way, Ukrainians and their country can start to heal and hope for a better tomorrow. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to extend my gratitude to USG De Carlo and Director Doughton for their timely briefings. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine to today's meeting. We are meeting today at a critical juncture of both fragile promise and alarming peril. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, after nearly 3 years, Russia and Ukraine resumed ceasefire negotiations, a significant step made possible largely due to the steadfast mediation efforts led by the United States. Of particular note, both sides agreed to the exchange of 1,000 prisoners each, and this swap was successfully concluded on Sunday. This was one of the largest humanitarian measures since the onset of the war, offering deep solace to countless families who have endured prolonged separation. We earnestly hope that this will serve, however small, as a stepping stone toward building trust between the two warring parties. However, the path toward comprehensive and lasting peace still appears distant. As today's briefers have already explained in detail, just days after these negotiations, Russia launched hundreds of sustained, large-scale drone and missile attacks across Ukraine, killing and injuring innocent civilians and destroying homes, schools, and other infrastructure. Let us be clear once again that these unjustifiable attacks serve as a grim reminder the world's alone will not stop the war, only action will. We reiterate that such massive and indiscriminate attacks against civilian infrastructure constitute clear violations of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Ukraine has already stated its agreement to a full and immediate ceasefire. It is now Russia's turn to demonstrate its true sincerity and political will, not just through words, but through concrete actions. The reality is that negotiations cannot proceed in good faith while missiles and drones are continuously bombarding Ukraine cities. Partial or fleeting time constraints ceasefire will not suffice. What is needed now is a complete and immediate cessation of hostilities. That is the only way to protect civilians and create the space for lasting diplomacy. We can no longer afford any further delay. Mr. President, as we have consistently emphasized, the war in Ukraine is not a distant or irrelevant conflict for the Republic of Korea. The large-scale transfer of arms and the deployment of 15,000 North Korean troops constitute a flagrant violations of multiple resolutions and the UN Charter. This collusion between Russia and North Korea not only seriously undermines international law and global norms, but also deteriorates global non-proliferation regime and directly threatens the lives and the security of innocent people in both Ukraine and the Korean Peninsula. Regrettably, it is no longer surprising that North Korean ballistic missiles are being used to kill and injure civilians in Ukraine. Furthermore, potential military assistance from Russia to North Korea and the combat experience being acquired by North Korean troops pose a serious and growing threat to the people of the Republic of Korea as well. As such, the illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, in blatant violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions, must cease immediately. Mr. President, we urge all members of this Council to speak with one voice to demand an immediate and full cessation of hostilities and to insist that negotiations proceed in a manner that upholds the UN Charter and the international law. The longer this war continues, the harder it will be to repair the damage to lives, to livelihoods, and to international peace. In this connection, we implore the international community to maintain the momentum needed to continue to push for an end to this senseless war, ensuring that both a ceasefire and peace are ultimately achieved. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under-Secretary General DiCarlo and Ms. Lisa Doughton for their insightful briefings. Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the devastating humanitarian and security consequences of the Ukraine conflict that has been raging for over 4 years now. Despite the hopeful momentum generated by diplomatic initiatives, including Security Council Resolution 2774, ceasefire understandings, and negotiations facilitated by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, we are alarmed by the recent reports of intensification of hostilities. This escalation, marked by increased attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, undermines the fragile progress achieved through painstaking diplomacy. Mr. President, I would like to make the following 3 points in this context. First, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation under international law, including the international humanitarian law. Pakistan deplores the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure under any pretext. All parties to conflict must uphold these principles without exception. Second, military means cannot resolve this conflict. Every day of continued hostilities deepens the suffering of civilians, distancing the parties further from a negotiated settlement. Pakistan reiterates its firm belief that only dialogue and diplomacy can deliver sustainable peace. Third, the fragile foundation of peace laid down by the diplomatic efforts needs consolidation. We welcome the direct talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, including agreements on prisoner exchanges, as steps in the right direction. However, these efforts are being overshadowed by the worsening situation on the ground. Diplomatic channels must not be abandoned in favor of escalation. Instead, the parties must redouble their commitment to dialogue, building on the existing frameworks to achieve a durable ceasefire, leading to a lasting solution. In this context, we take note of Russia's offer to hold a second round of direct negotiations in Istanbul and hope that the two sides could make further progress in bringing this protracted conflict to an end. Mr. President, Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has remained clear and consistent. From the outset, we have advocated for an immediate de-escalation to prevent further loss of life, urged all sides to follow meaningful negotiations addressing mutual security concerns within the framework of the UN Charter, supported inclusive and constructive diplomacy involving key regional and international stakeholders to pave the way for a just and lasting peace. In closing, Mr. President, Pakistan reiterates its firm support for a peaceful resolution of this conflict. The alternative, a continued conflict with no end in sight, serves no one's interests. Pakistan stands ready to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, the relevant multilateral agreements, and which addresses the legitimate national security interests of all sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to thank Undersecretary DiCarlo for her briefing, and thank Director Doughton for her intervention. Colleagues, more than 3 months have passed since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Following that historic resolution, the United States has worked tirelessly with both sides, seeking a path to peace. We want an end to this war. As the first step on that path to peace, the United States put forward a proposal for an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. Ukraine unequivocally accepted, pending Russia's agreement to do the same. Since then, we have been urging Russia to accept a ceasefire. Following President Trump's May 21 call with Russian President Putin, the Russian Federation is expected to provide a term sheet broadly outlining its vision for a ceasefire. We will judge Russia's seriousness towards ending the war not only by the contents of that term sheet, but more importantly, by Russia's actions. On that note, we condemn Russia's decision over the past weekend to launch some of the largest missiles and drone strikes against Ukraine since the beginning of the war. This disregard for human life does not demonstrate a desire for peace. It must cease. On the other hand, the recent agreement by both Russia and Ukraine to exchange 1,000 prisoners is an indication of what might be possible. If both Russia and Ukraine are truly interested in peace, the United States will work with both parties, with European partners, and with the United Nations to help achieve that goal, beginning with a meaningful ceasefire. But we will insist the discussion of peace by both sides must be undertaken in good faith. If Russia makes the wrong decision to continue this catastrophic war, the United States will have to consider stepping back from our negotiation efforts to end this conflict. To be clear, in doing so, we would not be abandoning our principles or our friends. Rather, we would be recognizing Russia's refusal to work with us toward a desirable outcome. As President Trump has made clear, we want to work with Russia, including on this peace initiative and an economic package. There is no military solution to this conflict. The deal on offer now is Russia's best possible outcome. President Putin should take the deal. The alternative, continuing to wage the war, would not be in anyone's interest, including Russia's. Doing so would continue to damage Russia's economy, military resources, national security, and international reputation. Additional sanctions on Russia are still on the table. President Trump has emphasized from the beginning that this war was a strategic mistake and should never have happened. Time is not on the side of anyone who would prolong it. We will call on both Russia and Ukraine to make the difficult, historic decision to pursue peace. The responsibility of ending this war ultimately lies with them. If one side proves unable or unwilling to do so, it will own the consequences. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and Ms. Lisa Dalton for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, it is regrettable that over the past few days there were signs of de-escalation in Ukraine through the first direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in more than 3 years. And these negotiations were aimed at achieving a ceasefire and finding a peaceful solution to end the war between these two parties. It is regrettable that these recent hostilities once again have driven the situation towards confrontation. Ongoing military operations between the parties still pose a multifaceted threat. They pose a threat to civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, and they pose a threat to infrastructure, including social infrastructures and vital facilities. This undermines any diplomatic effort aimed at ending this protracted war. In this regard, we would reaffirm our full condemnation of attacking and targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. This is a blatant violation of international law and of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Algeria has always expressed its concern about the military escalation between the parties. That escalation has only led and will continue to lead to the loss of more innocent lives, and it will endanger the safety and security of civilians and will destroy vital institutions such as healthcare, education, and energy facilities, without mentioning the serious repercussions on the food and energy systems. This will continue to impact the entire world, particularly developing countries. Among these developments, Algeria renews its call on both parties to refrain from escalation and military confrontation and to put an end to human suffering and to fully adhere to the provisions of international humanitarian law. That law holds the parties responsible for protecting civilians. Algeria also reiterates its appeal to both sides to prioritize constructive dialogue and consultations and to focus efforts on advancing negotiations and improving opportunities for reaching consensus, while at the same time overcoming and removing obstacles hindering this process. Moreover, Algeria urges all parties to reject polarization, which will only widen the divisions and undermine mediation efforts. They need to adopt approaches aimed at strengthening inclusive and constructive dialogue to prevent a return to escalation and further aggravation between the two parties. In this regard, Algeria welcomes the many ongoing efforts to facilitate dialogue between the two sides and to bring their divergent views closer together. These efforts were recently reflected in the direct meeting between the two parties in Istanbul, Turkey. We also welcome the prisoner exchange agreement reached during the same meeting. This is an important step, and it is a tangible example of the benefits of constructive dialogue and the possibility of fostering mutual understanding and consensus between the two parties. By way of conclusion, Algeria reaffirms its commitment to supporting all international efforts aimed at finding a peaceful, fair, and lasting solution satisfactory to both parties, and that is based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and which takes into account the legitimate security concerns of both sides. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation thanks USG DiCarlo and Director Ducton for their briefings. Mr. President, the current development serves as a reminder of the ongoing volatility in the region and the far-reaching consequences for civilian populations and infrastructure. Recent incidents underscore the urgent need for renewed efforts to reduce tensions and prevent further escalation. We take note of the forthcoming meeting between the representative of Russia and Ukraine planned for next Monday in Istanbul. This initiative represents an important opportunity to advance dialogue and build momentum towards a peaceful settlement. Mr. President, my delegation welcomes all constructive engagement and aimed at fostering mutual understanding and facilitating substantive negotiation. In this context, we call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire by all parties and urge restraint and to prevent any further deterioration of the situation. Lasting peace in Ukraine will only be possible through genuine diplomatic commitment, open channels of communication, and respect for established principles under international law. Constructive engagement remains essential. Only through sustained diplomatic efforts and willingness to compromise can a durable and just peace be achieved. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its call for comprehensive de-escalation, renewed diplomatic engagement, and pursuit of negotiated lasting peace in Ukraine. We stand ready to support all efforts that move us closer to this shared goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Dalton for their briefings. Recently, Russia and Ukraine held direct negotiations in Istanbul and reached consensus on the exchange of prisoners. The prisoner swap has now been completed smoothly, and Russia and Ukraine will soon hold a second round of direct negotiations. China welcomes these positive developments and supports all efforts towards achieving peace. At the same time, the two parties to this conflict are still engaged in large-scale drone and missile attacks. The fighting shows no sign of stopping, and the number of civilian casualties continues to rise. This pains our hearts and is deeply worrying. It fully shows that the Ukraine crisis involves complex dynamics and problems and cannot be resolved overnight. Here I wish to make 3 points. First, parties concerned to the conflict should demonstrate political will, maintain the momentum of peace talks, address the root causes of the crisis through dialogue and consultation, and reach a fair, lasting, and binding peace agreement acceptable to all parties concerned, so as to ultimately realize a political settlement. Second, parties to the conflict should real earnest abide by international humanitarian law and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure under all circumstances. Both sides should make concerted efforts and take active measures to cool down the situation on the battlefield. Third, the international community, especially important stakeholders, should increase their reasonable cause for a ceasefire to end the fighting and for promoting peace talks, and should create a positive atmosphere and enabling conditions and provide necessary assistance to facilitate a political solution to the crisis. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. Since the start of the crisis, we have been calling for a dialogue, negotiation, and a political settlement, and we remain fundamentally guided by the 4 principles put forward by President Xi Jinping. Our position is that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be abided by, that the reasonable security concerns of all parties should be taken seriously, and that all efforts for peace should be supported. China has stayed in contact with both Russia and Ukraine and has been working consistently to promote peace talks. China, together with Brazil and other countries of the Global South, initiated the Friends of Peace group on Ukraine crisis, which aims at building international consensus and promoting peace efforts to facilitate a political solution to the crisis. On the 13th of May, China and Brazil issued a joint statement on the Ukraine crisis, supporting direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, and stating the expectation of the start of fruitful negotiations between the parties concerned to build greater consensus and realize a political settlement. Together with the Global South and the international community, China will continue playing a constructive role for achieving real peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Panama considera
Panama believes
el llamado a esta reunión
that it was interesting to call for this meeting given the critical turn of events in the conflict in Ukraine. We are grateful to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, USG for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, OCHA, for their briefings and their valuable contributions. We acknowledge the presence of representatives from the delegation of Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, Poland, and Iceland, and the European Union.
Panama reitera su
Panama
consternación
reiterates
ante la
its
prolongada
alarm
guerra en
at the
Ucrania,
protracted
que
war in
continúa
Ukraine,
provocando la
which
pérdida de vidas
continues to lead
humanas, múltiples
to
heridos
the loss
y
of human life,
desplazados.
countless
Tal y
injured
como
and
hemos
displaced.
manifestado en este y otros
As we have
conflictos,
said on this and
condenamos los
on other
incesantes
occasions
ataques
regarding
dirigidos contra la
conflicts,
población
relentless
civil
attacks
y hacemos
against
un
the
llamado
civilian
urgente para el
population.
cumplimiento del derecho internacional
In those
humanitario.
circumstances, we urgently
En
call
este
for
sentido,
compliance with
lamentamos
IHL.
los recientes
We
ataques
therefore condemn
que, según
recent
los
attacks,
informes
which, according
disponibles,
to
las
available
fuerzas
reports,
rusas llevaron a cabo con misiles
Russian
y
forces
drones
carried out with
durante
missiles
3
and
noches
drones
seguidas
for
el
3
24,
consecutive nights on the
25
24th,
y 26 de
25th, and
mayo
26th of
en
May
Kiev y
in
otras
Kiev
regiones,
and other
impactando a
regions
la población e
against
infraestructuras civiles.
civilian population
De
and
acuerdo con el
infrastructure.
comunicado del Alto
According to
Comisionado
a communique
Volker
by the High
estos
Commissioner
ataques
Volker Turk,
ocasionaron la muerte
these
de 14
attacks
civiles,
caused the
entre
death
ellos
of
3
14
niños y
civilians,
alrededor
including
de
3
88
children,
heridos,
and
de los
injured
cuales
some
11 eran
88
niños.
people, of which
Una
11 were
generación de
children.
niños
A
ya están
generation
marcados
of
por el sonido de
children
las
have been
sirenas
traumatized by
antiaéreas
the sound
y
of
por la
air raid
pérdida de sus seres
sirens
queridos,
and by the loss
lo
of
que
their loved
representa un
ones.
fracaso
This
colectivo
is a
para la
collective
humanidad.
failure for
De
humanity.
igual manera, durante el pasado
Similarly,
fin de semana,
over the
un
past
gran número de
weekend,
drones de
a
largo
large
alcance
number
fueron
of
lanzados contra la
long-range drones
Federación
were
Rusa
launched against the
por las
Russian
Fuerzas
Federation
Armadas
by
ucranianas,
Ukrainian armed
hiriendo al
forces,
menos a 11
injuring
civiles,
at least
según las
11
autoridades
civilians,
rusas.
according to Russian
Panamá
authorities.
insiste en su llamado a un
Panama
cese
reiterates
inmediato de
its
las
call for an
hostilidades,
immediate
al
cessation of
respeto
hostilities,
irrestricto a la vida,
in
seguridad y
unconditional
dignidad de la
respect for
población
life,
civil
security, and
y al
dignity of
respeto a
the
la
civilian
soberanía e integridad
population,
territorial de
and in
Ucrania.
respect of the
La
sovereignty and
resistencia a un
territorial
alto al
integrity
fuego
of
provoca el
Ukraine.
sufrimiento de la población
Resistance to a
civil,
ceasefire is
quienes
causing
viven
suffering
rehenes de
for the
los
civilian
ataques
population,
ininterrumpidos
who is
y
being held
provoca un
hostage by
aumento de
sustained
desplazados
attacks, and this
internos,
has led to
los
an
cuales,
increase of
según las cifras de la
IDPs.
Oficina de las
According
Naciones
to
Unidas
figures from the
para la
United
Coordinación
Nations
de
Office for
Asuntos
the Coordination of
Humanitarios,
Humanitarian
hasta
Affairs,
principios del
by the beginning
2025
of
son más de
2025,
3.6
there were
millones de
more than
personas.
3.6
Los
million
esfuerzos políticos y
IDPs.
diplomáticos
Political and
han
diplomatic
propiciado
efforts
el
have
intercambio
led
de
to the
prisioneros
start
y el inicio de
of
conversaciones encaminadas hacia un proceso de
efforts
paz.
aimed at
Por
talks
lo que es
towards a peace
imprescindible
process. It is therefore
continuar
essential
los esfuerzos
to continue with
diplomáticos
diplomatic
y crear
efforts
un clima
and to
de
create
confianza
a
y
climate
diálogo
of trust
permanente,
and ongoing dialogue,
absteniéndose de acciones
and to
que
abstain
continúen la
from any
escalada del
actions
conflicto
which will
y perjudiquen las
perpetuate the
oportunidades
conflict
de un
and
arreglo
jeopardize
político.
the opportunities
En
for a
esta misma
political
línea,
settlement.
la capacidad de
Similarly,
negociación para
the
encontrar
ability
puntos
to
de acuerdo,
negotiate in order to
demostrada
find
mediante la reciente
points of
repatriación de
convergence
prisioneros de guerra,
demonstrated
es
in
una
the recent
práctica que debe
repatriation of
continuar
prisoners of
siempre en
war is a
consonancia con los
practice which
principios del
must
derecho
continue,
internacional
always
humanitario.
in accordance with the
Presidente, el
principles
eco
of
de este
IHL.
conflicto
Mr.
afecta
President, the
también las cadenas de
repercussions of this
suministros de la
conflict are
economía
felt
global,
as well
exacerbando
on
las
the
múltiples
global
crisis
economy
que
and
los países
supply
en
chains,
desarrollo
exacerbating the many
por lo
crises
cual
we as
es
developing
menester
countries
de la
face.
comunidad
And therefore,
internacional
the international
aportar en todas las
community needs
iniciativas
to
que contribuyan
support
a su solución
any
pacífica.
initiative leading to a peaceful
Panamá alienta
solution.
a las partes para que el
Panama
diálogo y la
encourages the
diplomacia
parties
sean
to
la única
choose
vía posible hacia el
diplomacy as the
entendimiento
only
y el
possible way
compromiso de una paz
to
justa y duradera en
understanding
Ucrania,
and a commitment to
conforme lo
just and
dispuesto
lasting peace
por
in
la Carta de
Ukraine,
las Naciones
pursuant
Unidas
to the
y el derecho
provisions of the UN
internacional.
Charter and
Muchas
international
gracias.
law. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement, and now give the floor to the Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG DiCarlo and Director Doughton for their briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the conflict in Ukraine moves beyond day 1,190, it is essential that the Security Council remains actively engaged in efforts to forge a path towards peace and bring an end to the conflict, which continues to claim innocent lives and cause widespread devastation. In recent days, attacks on densely populated areas across Ukraine have resulted in at least 13 civilian deaths and 65 injuries, including women and children. Several regions in Ukraine remain particularly affected, with the period of 24 to 28 May reported to be the most intense assault since 2022. Drone attacks targeting areas in Russia, including Moscow, and also signal an alarming escalation. The indiscriminate use of long-range missiles and drones on both sides underscores a troubling development
not in line with the principles of international humanitarian law and imperative to protect civilian lives. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned by the continuing escalation of retaliatory attacks, even as diplomatic efforts are underway to secure a ceasefire. After more than 3 years of active conflict, it is increasingly clear that a military solution is unattainable. Only a negotiated ceasefire and a comprehensive peace agreement, one that takes into account the legitimate concerns of all parties, will offer a pathway to sustainable peace. The humanitarian consequences of the conflict have been devastating. Since February 2022, a conservative estimate puts the number of casualties at approximately 45,001, including over 13,134 killed. Children remain disproportionately affected, with more than 220 killed or injured between January and April 2025, and many subjected to mental and psychological trauma due to the persistent threat of violence and disruption of essential services, including education. We reiterate our call for the return of Ukrainian children who have been forcibly removed or separated from their families. We also note the recent statement by UN Women on the disproportionate impact of the conflict on women's lives and livelihoods, and we emphasize the need for women's full and meaningful participation in peace negotiations and recovery processes on both sides. Mr. President, approximately 12.7 million people in Ukraine require life-saving humanitarian assistance this year. We commend the bravery and dedication of humanitarian workers who continue their efforts despite ongoing risks. Sierra Leone deplores the killing of 2 humanitarian workers and the injury of 16 others during the months of March and April. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel, must remain an essential obligation in accordance with international humanitarian law and the fundamental principles of human dignity. The widespread destruction of critical infrastructure, including healthcare, education, water, energy, and gas facilities, has deepened an already dire humanitarian crisis. The World Bank has estimated this year's damages at approximately $176 billion, with long-term reconstruction and recovery projected at around $525 billion over the next decade. In this regard, we join the call for sustained and increased support to the Ukraine Humanitarian Response Plan and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, noting with concern that recent funding shortfalls have led to the suspension of scaling back of essential humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in light of the enduring and far-reaching consequences of this conflict, Sierra Leone urges all parties to recommit to meaningful ceasefire and peace negotiations. We acknowledge the efforts of the United States, European leaders, and regional actors who continue to facilitate dialogue aimed at the escalation. We also take note of the positive developments, including the recent exchange of approximately 1,000 prisoners of war and civilian detainees from both sides as a significant confidence-building measure. At this critical juncture, we call on both sides to prioritize peace and the well-being of their populations and engage in direct, high-level dialogue. We further urge the escalation of military activities, including the mobilization of troops along border regions. In conclusion, this Council must remain engaged in supporting the parties towards a comprehensive ceasefire and a stable peace, including in areas such as Black Sea, which is vital to global commerce. Our efforts must remain guided by the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for full adherence to international law, particularly international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the facilitation of unhindered humanitarian access, and renewed diplomatic engagement aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DeCarlo and OCHA Director Lisa Dotton for their updates. and welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, Poland, Iceland, and the European Union in today's meeting. Mr. President, like clockwork, this Council knows that every month we will meet to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Some months, as many as 4 times. In similar terms, we have grown accustomed to expecting that the meetings will conclude, having not reached or gotten any closer to a solution. Yet each time we meet, we are briefed about the worsening situation as lives and livelihoods continue to be shattered. It is time that this cycle is broken and progress is made towards ending this war. The briefings highlight in very stark terms the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, a situation that has tragically worsened in recent weeks with drone and missile strikes. The recent aerial strikes over the weekend are reportedly the largest seen so far in the war and have claimed the lives of several civilians, including children. It came at a time when considerable efforts are being made to achieve a ceasefire. We are deeply disappointed that there have been setbacks along the road to a lasting ceasefire and welcome the recent announcement of a follow-up meeting between the 2 parties. We took positive note of the first meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials in Istanbul on May 16, which resulted in the exchange of 1,000 prisoners on each side. We welcome such efforts, which we hope will ultimately lead to a ceasefire and a much-needed respite for the Russian and Ukrainian people. Mr. President, on the humanitarian situation, Guyana deplores the continued killing and maiming of civilians and calls for an immediate end to the indiscriminate attacks. International humanitarian law is clear. Conflict parties must take all feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm. Guyana continues to stress that the consequences of such violations of international law are not confined to borders and cannot be left unchecked. OHCHR has repeatedly sounded the alarm about widespread and systematic attacks being carried out in Ukraine. We are now hearing about the use of drones with embedded cameras that are focused on visibly civilian targets. Guyana calls for an end to this senseless violence and for full accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. We also reiterate that central to achieving a permanent ceasefire in the current context is the need to reach an agreement on the immediate cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access, including to the temporarily occupied territories, and the provision of necessary security guarantees inter alia. At this critical juncture, we urge the parties to remain focused and to avoid any missteps that could doom millions of Ukrainian and Russian citizens to even more bombardment and displacement. We remain supportive of all efforts aimed at bringing the parties together to achieving a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. We also urge this Council to engage constructively toward that end. 3 years on, it should be clear to all that there is no military solution and no winners in this war. Finally, we must all uphold our responsibility and, as custodians of peace and defenders of the UN Charter, work together to ensure the protection of civilians wherever they are. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we'd like to once again state for the record that we completely disagree with the Presidency's approach that is inviting delegations to today's meetings under Rules 37 and 39. Aside from Ukraine, there are 5 more delegations who've been invited. They're either NATO members or EU members or their allies. Every time these delegations spend at least half an hour of our precious time given the budget deficit at the UN, the very valuable time of the Security Council, so as to read out the same narratives with zero added value, in addition to the representative of the EU. This situation is unacceptable, and responsibility for this falls squarely on the shoulders of the Presidency. Without a doubt, the European nations, when they hold the presidencies of the Security Council, are simply impossible to place the impartiality of the Security Council above bloc solidarity. This undermines our credibility and the value of our discussions. However, we are counting on European delegations, especially the main sponsors sponsors pumping the Kiev regime full of weapons. We hope they will also ask to speak tomorrow at the briefing we requested on the theme of European attempts to thwart the peace process surrounding Ukraine. We have a lot of questions, and we will be expecting answers. We aren't expecting answers. But we do have the hope that the EU will answer at least some of them, not as part of a staged EU-NATO event organized by them for their purposes, based on preparations made by Brussels. But, as called for here at the Security Council, as part of an interactive discussion as the entire international community looks on. Strategic sovereignty was lost long ago by our former European partners, and they are incapable of doing what I just asked for. President, the script of today's meeting is absolutely clear and predictable. This meeting, much like previous similar initiatives undertaken by our Western and of late European colleagues specifically, these meetings are convened not to resolve problems nor to bring the Ukrainian crisis closer to a peaceful settlement. The goal is to stop an image of a supposedly free and democratic Ukraine from being definitively deflated. Ukraine, which has the image of a victim of a so-called Russian aggression, an image which the European sponsors of the regime in Kiev are trying to keep afloat. They've been doing this for years now. They began creating this image long before Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine. It's becoming increasingly difficult for London, Paris, Berlin, and their satellites to blow up this propaganda bubble, because the dictatorship in Kiev and the endeavors of the Kiev overstay princeling to cling to power at any costs, power he would lose if peace were to prevail, are patently obvious. The biggest fear of Zelensky are the elections when he and his sidekicks will have to answer for not keeping their promises about peace with Russia, not protecting the rights of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, respect for rights and freedoms in a country which he himself has turned into a concentration camp and a meat grinder. Moreover, as long as the bugbear of a Russian threat exists, the Zelensky policy doesn't have to account for all of the money stolen from state coffers, nor the stealing of Western and, in particular, U.S. assistance, which amounts to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. This isn't something Zelensky's European accomplices and the Biden administration want, those who have profited handsomely from the Ukrainian conflict. That's why the main objective of this group of militarists is to prevent the main shareholder, the U.S., from exiting the Ukraine anti-Russia geopolitical project. They want to prolong the war for as long as possible. This isn't easy, because the new U.S. administration has, over the last few months, opened its eyes and seen the true colors of the Zelensky regime, as well as the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict. That's why they're resorting to any and every provocation, any and all lies about Russia, its activities and plans. Today, once again, in this chamber, they're asking us to believe that Russia is knowingly shelling residential areas of Ukrainian cities, serving up as evidence the consequences of Ukrainian air defenses, which have been stationed next to homes and social infrastructure in violation of basic norms of international humanitarian law. At the same time, what's being hushed up is the fact that our strikes target exclusively facilities linked to Ukraine's military-industrial complex, and we are successfully destroying or rendering these facilities inoperable. Over the last few days, we've hit munitions storages and military technologies in the Dnipropetrovsk region, a temporary deployment site, and rocket and artillery munitions warehouses of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Mechanized Brigade in the Sumy area, as well as a temporary deployment site for foreign mercenaries in Svetogorsk, in the DPR, and in the Kharkov regions. A strike was conducted on a defense industry plant in Ukraine. That's the Pavlogradsky chemicals plant in the Dnipropetrovsk region. We destroyed 2 Patriot anti-aircraft missile system launchers. Rockets were fired on an unloading and storage area containing military equipment and munitions in Odessa port. This resulted in the destruction of roughly 100 containers containing important components for uncrewed vessels, UAVs, as well as munitions. What is also being hushed up is the fact that the Russian Federation is doing what I just mentioned only in response to massive and deliberate shelling on the part of the Kiev regime of peaceable Russian cities. Thus, despite the fact that the Russian Federation called a 72-hour ceasefire to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, between the 8th and the 11th of May, we recorded over 14,000 violations, over 4,000 attacks by artillery, tanks and mortars, 62 attacks using MLRSs, 9,900 strikes and releases of munitions from UAVs. We recorded 5 attempts to break through Russia's state border in the Belgorodsk and Kursk regions, as well as 37 attacks waged by the Ukrainian armed forces. In those 3 days, an aggression was waged by Bandera's followers, which claimed the lives of 6 Russian civilians and at least 17 people were injured. It's very telling that the most massive attacks by UAVs on civilian objects in Russian cities, including Russia, far removed from the front line, were waged by Kiev after we saw nascent progress towards peace. Specifically, they waged these attacks after direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul were resumed and set a course towards an end to the conflict. Between 8 p.m. on the 20th of May and 8 a.m. on the 27th of May, what was destroyed and intercepted is 2,331 UAVs launched from Ukraine, including 1,465 which were outside the area where we're conducting this special military operation. Regrettably, as a result, there were civilian casualties, including women and children. On the 22nd of May, due to an attack on the village of Panteleimonovka in the Donetsk People's Republic, 8 people were wounded. On that very same day, in the Vassilievsk municipality in the Zaporizhia region, owing to a UAV strike, a woman died. She was born in 1990. 4 children were wounded. The Ukrainian armed forces also struck civilian objects in the city of Lvov in the Kursk Oblast using HIMARS, and 16 people were wounded, including 2 children. President, the plans concocted by Zelensky and his accomplices are plain and clear. Their goal is to trick and to disorient President Trump, who is taking decisive steps towards peace. At any cost, they want to return the United States, which has lost hundreds of billions of dollars helping Ukraine, to return the U.S. to an anti-Russian and Russophobic course. We will discuss their methods and tactics in detail tomorrow, which are aimed at undermining the efforts of Russian, U.S. and other regional mediators' efforts. We'll do this tomorrow, as we requested a topic on the specific, a meeting on the specific topic. We won't do that now. What I will say now is that promoting Ukrainian and Western lies about Russia is becoming increasingly difficult, because the actual actions of the Kiev regime, its deliberate choice, that is war, and the further suffering of their citizens speak volumes. What's also absolutely clear are the peace initiatives and concrete steps being taken by the Russian leadership. We intend to continue pursuing this course, as well as to continue a serious, direct negotiations process with Ukraine, which Ukraine itself suspended in April 2022, egged on by the British Premier Boris Johnson and like-minded Russophobes. The outcome of this process should be a decision, or rather a solution, which would reliably address the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict and the threats to the security of my country emanating from Ukraine. Ukraine has been invited to meet in Istanbul on the 2nd of June and to discuss the content of our memoranda regarding approaches to the negotiations process. While Kiev continues attempting to prolong the war and to provoke Russia striking at residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, while they do that, we will continue our special military operation and we will continue destroying objects linked to Kiev's military capabilities. No new anti-Russian sanctions, nor deliveries of weapons to Ukraine or any other hostile steps vis-à-vis Russia will be able to prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The ball is in Ukraine's court. Either talks followed by peace, or the unavoidable defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield with different conditions for the conflict's end. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Greece. I would like to thank Undersecretary Di Caro and OCHA Director Doughton for the detailed briefings. Colleagues, it has already been a month since the Council was last seized of the war in Ukraine. One would hope that in the meantime, peace talks under the US-led initiative would have borne tangible results. After all, the United States and Ukraine agreed to a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire almost 3 months ago, and all parties to the war, including Russia, have declared their intention to achieve a peaceful settlement. Yes, this ceasefire still eludes us on Russian responsibility. Instead of building on the promise of peace, there has been a continuation of deadly attacks in May, while noting that April, according to verified data of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, becomes a deadly month not only for Ukrainian civilians in general since September 2024, but particularly for children since June 2022. As the UN Humanitarian Coordinator has stressed, across Ukraine, no place is safe. We echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the latest attack and join our voice with the overwhelming majority of the UN membership, which in multiple General Assembly resolutions have demanded the cessation of hostilities and the return to peace in full respect of international law and the UN Charter. Greece condemns any targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure as a clear violation of the basic tenets of international humanitarian law and demands accountability for the perpetrators and justice for the victims. In this regard, we commend the role of UN agencies such as UNICEF for the multifaceted support to civilians and in particular to children, as well as the tireless efforts and courage of humanitarian workers who have also suffered increased casualties these last months. Colleagues, regrettably, peace efforts, culminating in the attempts at direct bilateral negotiation on May 16, did not produce any breakthrough. On the contrary, they have so far further confirmed Russia's intransigence. At the same time, the agreement for the largest exchange of prisoners of war and civilian detainees between the two sides since the start of the war is a welcome development and the only tangible deliverable of the negotiation. In closing, let me reiterate that Greece's stance through this 39th month of war has been principled and consistent in favor of international law, including international humanitarian law and the principle of the UN Charter. In that respect, we reiterate that a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire should remain our first priority on the way to our ultimate goal of achieving, firstly, a permanent cessation of hostility, secondly, a just, comprehensive and lasting peace achieved through inclusive diplomacy in line with the UN Charter and international law that upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity, and thirdly, security guarantees that will prevent the recurrence of war. I thank you. I resume now my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I express gratitude to the Greek presidency for convening today's Security Council meeting, and thank USG Di Carlo and OCHA's representative, Ms. Doughton, for substantive briefings. Today is already the 1,191st day of Ukraine's resistance against the Russian Federation's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified full-scale military invasion. Russia's aim remains unchanged: to subjugate Ukraine militarily, seeking control over our entire nation to further its imperialistic ambitions. Failing to achieve these objectives independently, it enlists support from authoritarian regimes such as the DPRK and Iran. Moreover, Ukrainian intelligence has confirmed that China is supplying special chemicals, gunpowder, and machinery to 20 Russian military factories, and this cooperation must cease immediately.
Ukraine continues to defend itself in full accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We are grateful for the unwavering support of the European and American and other partners and allies, which bolsters our defense capabilities. Simply put, Ukraine did not initiate this war, nor do we desire its continuation today. On its part, Russia could end its aggression at any moment, but persistently rejects all credible paths to peace. Mr. President, Ukraine has consistently demonstrated commitment to diplomacy and remains open to any format that can yield tangible results. We supported the U.S. proposal for a 30-day full interim unconditional ceasefire agreed upon in Jeddah on 11 March. Ukraine firmly believes that at least 30 days long ceasefire must be the first step towards negotiations on just and lasting peace. We reaffirmed this proposal multiple times, but Russia consistently refuses to accept it. Russia's actions clearly indicate its unwillingness for peace. On 20 April, despite media reports of Russia's alleged readiness for so-called Easter ceasefire, Russian forces carried out 1,882 shelling attacks, conducted 33 multiple launch rocket system strikes, and deployed 957 kamikaze drones against Ukraine. Russia again declared solely through media channels its readiness for a ceasefire since 8 till 10 May. In practice, it launched 115 airstrikes, dropped 197 guided aerial bombs, carried out 12,100 shelling attacks, including 187 by multiple launch rocket systems, and targeted civilian infrastructure with 7,303 kamikaze drones. This is what Russia's so-called ceasefire entailed. On 10 May, Ukraine, alongside European leaders from France, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, supported by the U.S. and other partners, called Russia again to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. The collective will of Ukraine and its partners was clear. If the Russian Federation refused, robust sanctions would be imposed on Russia, particularly targeting the energy and banking sectors. Russia's response was to reject an unconditional ceasefire and instead demand direct negotiations with Ukraine in Turkey. We are not afraid of talks. We are for constructive talks. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was ready for a personal meeting with Putin because only Putin decides the strategic issues of war and peace in Russia. Our president visited Turkey on 15 May, ready for a direct meeting, whether in Ankara or Istanbul. Putin, however, refused to attend, sending a low-level delegation lacking decision-making authority. Despite this, a high-level Ukrainian negotiating team, headed by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov, was ready to discuss the ceasefire. Notably, Russian delegation mostly consisted of the same individuals it had sent to Istanbul in 2022. This demonstrates that Russia has not altered its fundamental approach. Their goal is to transform the Istanbul meeting into a staged, hollow process reminiscent of the talks in 2022. It is not Ukraine or Western leaders who are undermining negotiations, as Russia claims. It is Russia that sends delegation with no decision-making mandate, effectively nullifying the prospects of diplomacy. The only positive result of the meeting in Istanbul is an agreed exchange of prisoners of war in the format 1,000 for 1,000, implemented on 23rd-25th May. Overall, if one sets aside all Russian nonsense, pseudo-historical statements, provocations, and the like, the Russian plan to present the Istanbul meeting as a continuation of March 2022 has failed. This is a completely new dynamic. The conditions for and realities are different now. In order to overcome the current diplomatic stalemate, there is a need for a meeting at the leaders' level, and President Zelensky has repeatedly reaffirmed his readiness to meet with Putin at any time and at any mutually agreeable location. We will continue to insist on an unconditional and complete ceasefire for at least 30 days as the only viable foundation for the success of any further discussions and steps. However, Russia is now trying to buy time in order to continue its war and occupy more Ukrainian land. It continues to intimidate and terrorize Ukrainian civilians by attacking the critical infrastructure and residential areas. All of this sends a clear signal. Russia does not desire to end this war and is neither willing nor ready for genuine negotiations. Russia's actions warrant full-scale pressure to limit its military capabilities and to push it toward real peace. The Istanbul meeting and its follow-up cannot and will not serve as an excuse not to increase pressure on Russia. On the contrary, it is proof of why such pressure is urgently needed. The strength of this pressure is inversely proportional to the Russians' willingness to be constructive and embark on a genuine peace process. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to escalate its brutal and systematic attacks on civilians across Ukraine. Day and night, Ukraine endures relentless waves of deadly drone and missile strikes. In May, their scale and intensity have reached unprecedented levels of devastation. On 24th and 25th May, the Russian Federation executed one of the largest combined assaults since the onset of its full-scale aggression, launching 83 missiles of various types and 548 drones against civilian targets across Ukraine. The attacks killed at least 12 civilians and injured dozens of others. In the Zhytomyr region, an airstrike on a residential neighborhood killed 3 siblings from one family: 8-year-old Stanislaw, 12-year-old Tamara, and 17-year-old Roman. On 26 May, Russia launched its largest drone attack since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, using 355 attack drones, along with 9 cruise missiles targeting civilian areas, again killing and injuring civilians and damaging or destroying residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. In just these 3 days, Russia launched over 900 attack drones, along with ballistic and cruise missiles. Russian terror against civilians continues every single day. Today, Russia launched an airstrike on the village in the Zaporizhzhia region, using guided bombs. The attack killed at least 2 civilians and injured 3 others. More than 50 homes are damaged and 5 were destroyed, and nearly 600 households lost electricity. These strikes lack military logic, and the aggressor state is gaining nothing. They are clearly intended to terrorize the civilian population, inflict widespread destruction, and reflect a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and a profound contempt for diplomacy. They also represent a deliberate political decision, Putin's decision to continue his war of aggression. Each such terrorist attack justifies the imposition of new strengthened sanctions against the Russian Federation. The silence of the international community only emboldens Putin. These ongoing attacks underscore the urgent need for continued and expanded support to protect Ukrainian civilians from indiscriminate violence. We are deeply grateful to every partner and ally assisting Ukraine in strengthening our air defense capabilities. The timely delivery of air defense systems saves lives. Ukraine welcomes the recent report by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which for the first time documents Russia's systematic drone attacks against civilians in the Kherson region. This inhuman tactic of terror has continued for a long time and must not go unpunished. Threats to Ukraine's civilian population represent a new and troubling aspect of modern warfare, potentially setting a precedent for future full-scale conflicts. A defining feature is the constant, direct threat of missile and long-range drone attacks across the entire country, even in regions over 1,000 kilometers from the front line. This sustained threat not only endangers civilian lives, but also severely impacts the psychological, security, and socio-economic well-being of the population. It is an integral element of Russia's military strategy that must be duly addressed within the UN broader efforts and discussions on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Mr. President, let's remind that thousands of Ukrainians, both civilians and military personnel, remain imprisoned in the Russian Federation or in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Many were captured before 2022. They continue to be subjected to torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence, in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Russia continues to return Ukrainians in a highly selective and arbitrary manner. Ukraine demands immediate and unconditional stop of all torture and ill treatment of detainees, and full adherence to the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners, as well as compliance with the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules and the Bangkok rules, which set gender-specific standards for the treatment of women in detention. Mr. President, the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains critically difficult, where all the 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety and security during an armed conflict continue to be systematically violated. Moscow blatantly disregards international diplomatic efforts, including by the United States, aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and ensuring global nuclear safety. According to Greenpeace, Russia is building a new high-voltage power line in the temporarily occupied territory of Zaporizhzhia region to illegally connect the NPP to the Russian power grid. Let me stress that disconnecting the NPP from Ukraine's power grid significantly increases the risks. In the event of an emergency, the plant could lose its last reliable source of external power. This is a direct path to a station blackout with potentially catastrophic consequences. Furthermore, Moscow's policy of blackmail and demonstrated disregard for international law forced the IAEA to conduct a second rotation through the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. We insist that despite Russian pressure, the IAEA remains committed to the principles of international law, in particularly the inviolability of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and does not recognize any changes in jurisdiction over the NPP. Ukraine urges the IAEA and the international community to respond to these actions by the Russian Federation decisively. The rotation of IAEA personnel should be carried out exclusively through the territory controlled by the government of Ukraine until the NPP is fully returned to its rightful owner, Ukraine. Mr. President, achieving peace at any cost will not end the war. A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace must rest on a fundamental respect towards non-negotiable principles. We repeat, Ukraine will never accept and recognize any part of its temporarily occupied territory as Russian. We will not tolerate interference in sovereign decisions, including our defense or alliances. There must be no appeasement of the aggressor. Such attempts only embolden future aggression. Russia is not signaling any genuine intention to stop its war. Therefore, we see no alternative but intensified international pressure, political, military, and economic. Sanctions must be expanded and strengthened. Russian oil, its shadow tanker fleet, financial networks, and its military industry must all be targeted. Russia is facing a moment when it needs to prove its seriousness. We need concrete decisions, first and foremost, regarding an unconditional and complete ceasefire for at least 30 days. Ukraine is ready to work for peace. Russia must also show that it is ready. As a confidence-building measure, we propose the immediate and unconditional return of all abducted Ukrainian children, prisoners of war, and detained civilians. For peace to endure, just must prevail. We welcome progress by the core group on establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Technical work on the necessary legal instruments is complete. Mr. President, at the heart of global peace and security lies the Charter of the United Nations. Upholding it is not optional, it is our collective duty. That is the standard by which each member of this Council, and indeed the international community, will be judged. Yet today we witness a great distortion of that duty. The Russian Federation, still present in the Soviet permanent seat, is using its status not to preserve peace, but to shield its war of aggression against Ukraine. This abuse strikes at the core of the international system we are all meant to uphold. Ukraine, for its part, seeks a just and lasting peace, one rooted in the principles of the UN Charter and reinforced by binding long-term security guarantees. Peace cannot rest on words alone, and particularly because words do not work with Moscow. It requires concrete steps, an immediate and just ceasefire, sustained diplomatic engagement, and the establishment of a credible security architecture centered around effective security guarantees for Ukraine that will prevent the recurrence of aggression. This is why Ukraine is working with all partners, the United States, the European Union, and all international partners, to build a broad-based, principled coalition for peace. But to succeed, the international community must act with unity and resolve. Now is not the time for hesitation. Now is the time to increase coordinated pressure, not merely to influence the course of Russia's war of aggression, but to bring it to a close and to secure peace for all our future generations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for her statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Czechia.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the Greek presidency of the Security Council for convening this important meeting. We stand at a critical juncture, a moment that demands we decide whether the senseless killing and suffering of civilians in Ukraine shall continue, or whether we shall finally see an end to Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion, now in its 12th year. The choice before Russia is stark and simple. No amount of diplomatic sophistry or propaganda can obscure this fundamental question. Is Putin's Russia prepared to end the death and suffering it has inflicted upon Ukraine? Ukraine has demonstrated its commitment to peace through actions, not merely words. President Zelensky has repeatedly stated Ukraine's readiness for an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire and the commencement of talks to end this war permanently. No strings attached, no preconditions. Meanwhile, Russia continues to play for time. When Russia's president suggested direct talks, Ukraine's president accepted without hesitation, ready to meet his counterpart face to face. Yet, while Ukraine stretches out its hand, the Kremlin bides its time. I invite you to draw your own conclusions about who genuinely seeks peace and who perpetuates killing and suffering. The past several days have reminded us yet again of Russia's true intentions. We have witnessed the relentless escalation of aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities that kill innocent civilians, including children, and devastate civilian infrastructure with calculated cruelty. The time has come to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Czechia joins others in calling upon this Council and the wider international community to help create the conditions for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace that upholds the UN Charter and all relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ladies and gentlemen, peace cannot be dictated by the aggressor. Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and right to choose its own future must be guaranteed. Mr. President, the path forward is clear. The choice is Russia's to make. The world is watching. End the invasion, respect international law, silence the guns, sit down at the table in good faith, end this now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Czechia for his statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Estonia.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of our three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We align ourselves with a statement by the European Union. I would like to thank briefers for their valuable input. President, there hasn't been a day since the beginning of the Russian aggression when Russia has not bombed Ukraine. Even this last weekend, while Russia claims that it is actively pursuing peace, it conducted the most intense wave of aerial attacks against Ukraine since the beginning of the aggression, using roughly 1,000 drones and missiles to deliberately attack civilians and civilian infrastructure. This terror should be condemned by all who claim to stand for peace and justice. President, since Russia's aggression, Ukraine has repeatedly expressed its unwavering commitment and political will to reach a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine agreed to a full and unconditional ceasefire proposed by the United States. President Zelensky expressed readiness to meet with Putin to discuss peace, but Russian side ignored this opportunity, sending a sham delegation to the meeting instead. We see Kremlin dragging its feet and using all sorts of fabricated excuses. while raising already unreasonable demands even further, making it clear that Moscow has no interest in agreeing to a real ceasefire in Ukraine. How long do we have to endure this drawn-out routine, all the while Russia keeps on implementing its genocidal policy? For how long? These attacks are not madness, but a deliberate attempt by Russia to eradicate any hope Ukrainians have. Russia is adopting the tactics of the Nazis, who systematically carpet-bombed London in 1940 and 1941, with sole aim of making the British population feel terrified, hopeless, and force its leaders to surrender. The Nazis failed, and so will Russia. President, Kremlin is trying to convince all of us, the United States in particular, that our support to Ukraine is futile. Russia is calculating that by demonstrating its ability to harm and bleed Ukraine, it can also paralyze our political will to support Kiev. However, Russia's assessment seems to be as adequate as was the original expectation to overrun Ukraine in 3 days. However, Russia's aggression and imperial zeal can only be curbed by increased joint international pressure. Pressure to force Russia into peace in Ukraine and cease Russian aggression once and for all. Persuasion and appeasement are perceived as a weakness in Moscow and therefore embolden the aggressor, only increasing support to the victim of aggression, Ukraine, and raising the cost of aggression for Russia can pave the way to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Full accountability is an integral part of any just peace. By establishing the Special Tribunal on Russia's crime of aggression against Ukraine, under the auspices of the Council of Europe, we bring to justice those individuals who have committed heinous crimes. President, we welcome the talks in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia on 16th of May, and the subsequent exchange of prisoners of war. We call on Russia to immediately proceed with an all-for-all prisoners swap, as Ukraine proposed a long time ago. The testimonies of the returned Ukrainian prisoners of war are consistent with the UN reporting on the widespread abuse and torture conducted in revived Russian Gulag prison network. We therefore urge Russia to respect international law and the Geneva Conventions, stop torture, starvation, and ill treatment of prisoners of war, and ensure their access to adequate medical assistance. Finally, President, we continue to stand by Ukraine and reiterate our collective effort aimed at reaching a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Estonia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, at the outset, let me thank the Greek Presidency for convening this important meeting and for accepting our request to participate in it. I also would like to thank the distinguished briefers for their insights. Mr. President, we meet on the 1,191st day of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. From the very first day, Poland, along with the other UN members, has been appealing for putting an end to the Russian war against Ukraine. All we wish for is a just and lasting peace at our borders. There have been 1,191 opportunities to end this aggression by introducing an immediate, full, and unconditional ceasefire that could open the way to genuine peace negotiations based on the full realization of international law. Unfortunately, for 1,191 days, President Putin has been deaf to the demands of the world. He pretends to be open to negotiations, while in reality, he simply plays for time in order to attain stronger position on the battlefield, no matter how many human lives it will cost. Russia has constantly and bluntly rebuffed any attempts to find a way to initiate a real peace talks offered by the different entities. Mr. President, best illustrations of Russia's lack of commitment to de-escalation was provided by the largest drones attack against Ukrainian cities since the beginning of the war, in parallel to the last weekend's Russian-Ukrainian exchange of 1,000 prisoners of war. The latter we welcome as a positive development. We condemn the latest Russian missile attacks on cities in Ukraine. Right after this body, the Security Council finished debating on the absolute necessity to protect the civilians in the times of the armed conflicts. Many innocent Ukrainians died or were wounded, including defenseless children. As per recent reports, April 2025 has been deadliest month for children in Ukraine since June 2022. At least 19 children were killed and 78 injured. We continue to call for holding Russia fully accountable for violation of international law, human rights, war crimes and crime of aggression at both state and individual levels. Mr. President, Poland actively supports US-led diplomatic efforts towards peace. To be sustainable, peace must be just, comprehensive and based on the UN Charter and its provision of sovereignty, territorial integrity and the equality of states. And it must be accompanied by the security guarantees not for Russia, but for the future without Russian attacks, not only against Ukraine, but also against other European countries. In conclusion, Mr. President, Poland will remain determined to continue a multifaceted support for Ukraine, including through financial, economic, humanitarian, and military and diplomatic means, for as long as it takes to help Ukraine exercise its inherent right to self-defense. Such resolve, in the face of the unprovoked and illegal invasion, remains a joint obligation of the international community. And I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Poland for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Iceland.
President, thank you for giving me the floor. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. Let me thank the briefers today for their substantive and solemn briefings. The Nordics have been stalwart supporters of the UN since its foundation. We are and always will be friends of the UN Charter, and we will continue to stand by it. Our common security depends on it. The General Assembly has repeatedly condemned Russia's blatant violations of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia will be held to account. No one wants an end to this war more than Ukrainians. We have joined Ukraine and international partners, including the US, in calling for a full, unconditional ceasefire, to which Ukraine has already committed more than 2 months ago. A ceasefire would end the suffering and allow for meaningful talks. It is now for Russia to reciprocate. Instead, Russia prevaricates. Instead, Russia continues to launch waves of attack on Ukrainian cities, which in the last 5 days have caused at least 160 casualties. Yet again, innocent children are paying the price for Russia's brutal war. The humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine has said that no place is safe. This is on top of many months of targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, residential neighborhoods, and energy facilities. All this at enormous cost in lives and destruction of property, and with total disregard for Russia's obligations under international humanitarian law. Russia could end this war tomorrow. Instead, it continues to pursue maximalist aims. Russia has consistently claimed that there are so-called root causes behind its war against Ukraine, as if it were somehow forced to act. But this is a false narrative. Russia made a deliberate choice to invade a sovereign nation, an unprovoked act in blatant violation of international law. President, Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have shown themselves to have extraordinary reserves of courage to provide resistance. They have prevailed for over 3 years and 3 months. All peace-loving countries that value the rule of law, international law, including the UN Charter, must unite to support Ukraine's struggle, and there can be no justification for continuing material or political support to Russia. It must stop now. This war must end. Not only is Ukraine's freedom and independence at stake, the credibility and integrity of the international system and this very institution is at stake. The neo-imperial and colonial ambitions of Russia have no place in the 21st century. We reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as we hopefully move closer towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Iceland for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. Please.
Mr. President, the candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. President, the EU reiterates its resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. I would like to thank DPPA and OCHA for the clear statements on the consequences of this war of aggression against Ukraine, and for the critical efforts in leading the United Nations political and humanitarian engagement in Ukraine. Colleagues, after countless Council meetings to address Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, where we have each repeated our core concerns and messages time and again, we should all be able to agree on at least one thing now, that a full and unconditional ceasefire is what is needed now as a necessary condition for meaningful peace discussions. Many of us, many of you, have called repeatedly for a ceasefire on several occasions and in different formats. Many have done so while stressing the importance of an end to this war grounded in the UN Charter, international law, and respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as applicable to all UN member states. Now is the time to make this a reality, end this illegal war and suffering, and achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter and international law. We welcome all efforts towards achieving such a peace. We, as Europeans, together with Ukraine, have been working tirelessly to this end. The European Union joins Ukraine, the United States, and other international partners in calling for a full and unconditional ceasefire of at least 30 days. This pause in hostilities would serve as a vital step towards reducing civilian suffering and allow for further exchanges of prisoners and the return of abducted children. It would also provide space for meaningful talks aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its readiness to accept a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire without preconditions, committing to such a step months ago. President Zelensky traveled to Turkey for direct talks with Russia's president, which unfortunately never materialized. As has been the case from the beginning of this war, it is now for Russia to show its own willingness to achieve peace. To date, it has not done so. Last weekend, it launched its largest attack on Ukraine's cities since the 2022 invasion, reportedly firing 355 drones and killing 13 people. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has noted the increase in civilian casualties resulting from Russia's aggression over the past months. In April, at least 209 civilians were killed and 1,146 injured. Russia's campaign of systematic airstrikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian critical infrastructure has not only not stopped, it has intensified. It violates international humanitarian law, undermines efforts for peace, and must finally stop now. Colleagues, we must all reiterate this message. All reiterate a continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders under the Charter. The EU will continue to support Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. The Council must exert full, principled, and effective diplomatic pressure for a full and unconditional ceasefire and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. We implore you to to do so immediately. Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. But don't go very far away. Stay in the vicinity, please.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We spend the rest of the hour with award-winning journalist and author Naomi Klein. She has a major new piece out, co-authored with Astra Taylor for The Guardian newspaper. It's headlined, The Rise of End Times Fascism. It looks at the apocalyptic fervor of the far right. In it, they write, quote, "The most powerful people in the world are preparing for the end of the world, and they themselves are frenetically accelerating. That is not so far away from the more mass-market vision of fortress nations that's gripped the far right globally, from Italy to Israel, Australia to the United States. In a time of ceaseless peril, openly supremacist movements in these countries are positioning their relatively wealthy states as armed bunkers," Naomi Klein writes. She's also professor of climate justice at the University of British Columbia, founding co-director of the UBC Center for Climate Justice. Her latest book, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World. Naomi, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. If you can start off by talking about your piece and what exactly you mean by talking about the end times, fascism.
Well, it's very good to be with you, Amy. This isn't the most cheerful piece I've ever written, with Astra Taylor, a very close collaborator, founder of the Debt Collective. And we were trying to kind of map what is similar and what is different about the type of far-right politics that we're seeing today. And I should say the piece is not only grim, it also looks at what this can mean for a response to this particular form of fascism, because we can't fight it if we don't understand it. So I think a lot of very good scholarship attempting to understand authoritarianism today, whether it's Trump or figures like Duterte or Modi, have looked at similarities between these far-right figures and, say, Mussolini or Hitler, and have taken a kind of a checklist approach of looking at what is similar to the past, right? And I think there's a lot of value in that, but the risk of it is that it doesn't look at what is new and what is particular to our time. Fascism always is an attempt by the right to resolve a crisis of its own era, right? So in the 1930s, they were attempting to resolve, in Germany, the humiliations of the First World War, the impacts of the Great Depression, and to propose a unity in the face of that, for the in-group. But our moment is different, and one of the things that makes it different, if you think about fascism in the 1930s, this is before the atomic bomb. It's before they understood climate change. And we are in a moment where our elites, whether they admit it or not, do understand that our economic model, and I've written books about this and talked about it with you in the past, is at war with life on Earth, right? And they are barreling down this road of more and more extraction of fossil fuels, of all kinds of, basically anything they can extract from this earth and turn into energy and money, particularly now with AI, which is a energy and resource hog, water, LNG, critical minerals, all of it. So we're trying to understand how this is informing the kind of fascism that we're seeing. And also, we're trying to understand what unites this kind of strange Frankenstein coalition that Trump represents, where he's bringing together these, the richest people in the world who have ever existed with many working class people. So what binds the vision, right? And what we come up with in this piece, or what we propose in this piece, is that they all have given up on this world. Like they all have bought into a kind of apocalyptic fever, right? Whether it's Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and their investments in outer space and sort of writing off this planet, whether AI, which is willing to sacrifice this animate world in order to build an artificial world, or whether it's the more populist MAGA vision of the fortress nation state, right, which is thinking, okay, we know more and more people are going to be coming. We know that disaster is on the horizon. I've listened to a lot of Steve Bannon for when I was writing Doppelganger, and it's all very survivalist, right? It's all of the commercials pretty much are selling gold because the economy is going to collapse, ready to eat meals for 90 days because you never know what's going to happen. So it sees the nation and the in-group as being inside the bunker, and then it's exiling the out-group to all of these lawless territories that you've been covering on the show. So it's not the same vision, but what it shares is this apocalyptic fever. And then, of course, all of it is following a similar structure, like narrative structure, to the biblical rapture. And of course, you have people who believe in that within the Trump coalition, who are Christian Zionists like Mike Huckabee and Pete Hegseth, who believe that the actual end time is coming, and they think it's all going to go down in Israel, and all of the horror that you report on so well and so committedly on the show. These are all good signs if you believe in the rapture, right? Because it means that the end is coming and the faithful are going to be lifted up to a golden city in the sky. So what we're looking at is like the religious version of that story, the fundamentalist religious version of that story, where you literally believe you're going to be saved and taken up to heaven. But also the secular vision, where your wealth protects you or your citizenship protects you, and you get your own version of that golden bunkered city.
You mentioned Gaza, and you just came from the Jewish Voice for Peace conference in Baltimore, where several thousand people gathered from around the country. Our latest headline, the Israeli military calling up tens of thousands of reservists as Israel's security cabinet unanimously approved plans this weekend to expand its assault on Gaza, where Israel's already killed over 52,000 Palestinians, and that's by far an undercount in the last 19 months. Israel's killed more than 2,400 Palestinians just since it shattered the ceasefire in March. This comes as Israel's devastating blockade and food aid has entered its third month. Palestinian health officials say 57 Palestinians have already starved to death. According to UNICEF, more than 9,000 children have been admitted for treatment for acute malnutrition so far this year, and aid groups like Norwegian Refugee Council blasting a new Israeli proposal to take control and distribution and put U.S. security contractors in charge. If you can talk, as you so often do, about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and what the centrality of Israel in President Trump and the current U.S. government, although it was also the past, President Biden's worldview and approach to foreign policy.
So I don't think there is a single answer to understanding what the driving forces are. And this is what we're trying to get at, is that there's a kind of an overlap of these different apocalyptic worldviews. Some of them are religious and some of them are secular, right? So I think that people who subscribe to this like literalist version of the rapture believe that all of this is good news, in the sense that, according to the story that they believe in, that the Israelites have to return to Greater Israel. Those are the preconditions for the return of the Messiah. They have to rebuild the third temple. So you have this convergence of interest between the religious extremists in the Netanyahu government, who are absolutely committed to rebuilding the third temple. They really want to do it. They want to destroy Al-Aqsa. This is why so much attention is focused on it. But then, does Trump believe that? I don't think Trump believes that. I mean, what he views for Gaza is he sees resources, he sees money, he sees a private, resort. Exactly. But this is something I've been saying from the beginning. I think the interests have been fairly consistent in terms of what the end goal is, which is a depopulation of Gaza, pushing Palestinians out, whether through death or whether through forced exile, whether through ethnic cleansing. And under the Biden administration, there was a denial that was what was going on, and under the Trump administration, it's all out in the open. So, this is what is going on. Now, what the reason for that is, I think, differs. But this is part of what we're getting at in the piece, Astra and I, is that there's a confluence of interest in terms of what Israel represents. Some of the supporters of the Trump administration in the tech industry are talking about wanting freedom cities, for instance, these privatized corporate cities. And they talk about this as tech Zionism. They have a lot of admiration for the idea that Israel was created, they say, from a book, Theodor Herzl's books. And they said, well, why can't we start our own country, our own private countries? Why do we have to abide by the rules of the nation state? So, I think part of the support for Israel isn't just our classic understandings either of Jewish Zionism or Christian Zionism, although that's absolutely going on. It's also this idea of a very technologically advanced startup country, right? Israel has marketed itself that way, and a lot of these tech companies want to do that in San Francisco. They want to push everybody out who doesn't agree with them, who's poor, who have more needs, and create their kind of corporate privatized utopia. So, I'm not saying this is a coherent agenda. I'm saying that there's a lot of overlapping stories that follow a similar structure and share similar goals, if that makes sense.
I mean, yes. The overall issue obviously is hard to make sense of, and most of Trump's supporters are neither wealthy nor are they Christian Zionists. So why are they backing this whole approach?
Well, it's not clear the extent to which they actively back it, but I think that they see a kinship in the ethno-state, right? Because a lot of Trump supporters are becoming increasingly Christian nationalist about the United States, and this has been, carefully fostered by figures like Steve Bannon. And so when they look at Israel, they see a country that is openly an ethno-state, that is fortressing itself in a sea of its enemies, and they want to do something similar, and they're sharing technologies, they're sharing legal precedents, tools. So there's a kinship, and and we're seeing this now with India with its attacks on Kashmir, following us, using similar techniques that Israel has used in Gaza. So there is a kind of a solidarity of the ethno-states, and they are sharing. They're even trading trinkets of, golden pagers and swapping chainsaws. This is something that I think, when you're inside the crucible of it here in the United States under Trump, it's hard to see the extent to which this is an international project on the right, and they are influencing one another.
And what does unite them, this whole fortress mentality, is this hatred of immigrants. You have President Trump just saying he doesn't even know, he's not a lawyer, so he doesn't know if he has to uphold the Constitution, he said.
Right. This is what I'm trying to get at about the awareness that we are in an age of consequences, that when you don't act in the face of the climate crisis for decades after, when scientists have been warning you, that more and more of the world becomes uninhabitable, and lo and behold, people move to try to find safety. in the face of wars, in the face of economic deprivation, and in the face of ecological disasters. And so that fortressing of the nation state, and this is what I think Israel's come to represent, just as a very small nation that is extremely fortressed, right? Whether it's with the high-tech walls, the Iron Dome. Trump says now, I want not an Iron Dome, but a Golden Dome, right? That's here. That all of this is whether it's stated explicitly
and
or
a military
not.
parade that'll cost tens of millions of dollars, even as he slices and dices the government on his birthday in June.
So the pattern is protecting the in-group and exiling and cleansing the out-groups, right? And so that, I think, is if there is support among the MAGA base for Israel, it's less out of a love for Israel than more out of an identification, like they are doing what we want to do here.
You write many things in your piece, and I just want to go to one of them. You say, in talking about Musk's apocalyptic vision you talk about, and also detailing the end times fascism, this whole issue of the rise of the city state, the corporate city-state. I think this is a new concept for many. They're not going to know what you're talking about. In southern Texas, Starbase, just this group of people who are mainly workers at SpaceX, have just voted to make a city right there.
Yeah, and we've had sort of, I mean, the idea of a company town is not entirely new, right? And Disney had Celebration Florida, and there are lineages to this, right? Colonial lineages to this. I live in Canada, which started as the Hudson's Bay Company, right? So it was a company before it was a country. So there's some precedent for this. But I think I've been following this out of the corner of my eye, Amy, because this is where the libertarians have been going for a while. Peter Thiel has been obsessed with this idea. It's increasingly being called exit, so exiting the nation and just starting your own country where you can set your own tax level, you can make your own regulations. Or not. And countries and these little corporate countries will compete with one another to try to attract capital, right? So in a way, it's an extension of the free trade zone, right? Where this is in a way like a denationalized country within a country. But Trump started to float this in 2023, the idea that he would create 10 freedom cities on the campaign trail. I don't think his base much knew what he was talking about, but now you have all these lobbyists who fully intend to take him up on it. And we're starting to see the beginning of this with the SpaceX city.
So you also write about El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, the notorious prison Secat, where so many hundreds of people have been sent from the United States. And at the same time, in the last 24 hours, President Trump saying he wants to reopen the notorious Alcatraz, an island in San Francisco. If you can talk about the prison as a model for what Trump wants to put forward, and particularly in relation, as we see, motivating so much to immigrants.
Well, this is an incredibly bleak vision. So repression is always a huge part of any kind of fascist project, right? You need to contain the outgroup. You need to disappear the outgroup. So this part of it is not new. But I think what is so worrying to me is that Trump was elected promising all kinds of things to his base, right? He promised to eliminate inflation. He promised to bring these great jobs home. He's not delivering on any of that. So the sadistic part of his project is really all he has to offer, right? I think one of the most chilling things I've ever seen in the United States was Trump sharing that video at his 100-day rally of just pure sadism, of just looking at prisoners as entertainment, being shaved, being shackled, being paraded. And he's not delivering on the price of eggs, and he's not delivering on the jobs, by the way, because he's throwing all in. He's going all in on AI. So the jobs that are coming back seem to be mainly for robots. It's not actually for his base. And so this scales up the need for the sadism and these spectacles, right? And I think that that's what something like Alcatraz represents. He's a TV producer first and foremost, right? He's producing spectacles, and the less he has to offer economically, tangibly, materially, the more he leans on the sadism.
You write, the governing ideology of the far right has become a monstrous supremacist survivalism. Our task is to build a movement strong enough to stop them. Mm-hmm. What would that movement look like, or what do you see is being formed right now?
Mm-hmm. You know, what we're doing in this piece by laying out the bleakness of the vision. And when I say bleakness, you know, I think it's beyond something we've seen before, because there's always an apocalyptic quality to fascism, but fascism of the 1930s and 40s had a horizon. Like, after the apocalypse, people were being promised a future, a pastoral, peaceful little piece of land where they could live out their lives, you know? Even though Trump talks about a golden age, there really isn't a future that the base believes in. You know, and this is what I've learned by consuming far too much MAGA media, Amy. They envision a future of endless war, right? And this is why they're bunkering down. This is why they're buying ready-to-eat meals to last. This is why they're buying gold and crypto. They think the whole thing is going down. So,
and why Elon Musk is trying to have so many children, at least 14 at this point, but he's actually explicitly texted it, saying, we've got to do this much faster, as he proposed to one of the women he has children with, saying, we got to start using surrogates.
So they don't believe in the future, is the bottom line. And that is, you know, I think I've been in a lot of progressive spaces in recent months where we've talked about building these very broad coalitions, including with people who we don't entirely disagree with. I've never encountered a potential coalition more broad than the idea of, how about if we believe in this world? How about if we believe in the future? Because we're up against people who are actively betting against the future, right? Not just actively betting against it, but fueling the fires that are burning this world, actively fueling it. So I think that if we have the courage really to look at the bleakness of what they believe in, which is an apocalyptic future, then we have our work cut out for us, being the people who actually believe in this realm, in this world, in the beauty of creation and of each other.
Naomi Klein, I want to thank you for being with us, award-winning journalist, author, columnist. We'll link to your piece with Astor Taylor, The Rise of End Times Fascism. I'm Amy Goodman. This is Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today in Wisconsin, where Democratic Governor Tony Evers is pushing back after Trump's so-called border czar Tom Homan suggested Wisconsin officials could be arrested if they follow local immigration policies that defy Trump's mass deportation agenda. He made the veiled threat when questioned last Thursday by the far-right website Gateway Pundit.
Your comments on the Wisconsin governor sending directives to state agencies to not comply with ICE and actually stop your deportation efforts.
I'd like to see what's coming. Any updates on the military? I meant what I said. You can not support what we're doing. And you can support sanctuary cities. That's what you want to do. But you cross that line of impediment or knowingly harbor concealing illegal alien, that is a felony. And we're treated as such.
Wait to see what's coming, said White House border czar Tom Homan, threatening Governor Tony Evers. Well, on Friday, the Wisconsin governor responded to Homan in a video statement posted online. Evers spoke in part about a memo he issued last month to Wisconsin state employees that echoes guidance given by other state and city governments, which instructs them to call a state lawyer if an ICE agent or other federal agent shows up at their workplace and questions them. It also tells workers not to give agents access to non-public areas. This is an excerpt of the video statement by Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers.
Yesterday, a Trump administration official, in not so many words, apparently threatened to arrest me for distributing guidance that asked state agency employees to consult with an attorney if federal agents show up at state buildings with legal documents. The goal of this guidance was simple: to provide clear, consistent instructions to state employees and ensure they have a lawyer to help them comply with all federal and state laws. Nothing more, nothing less. But Republicans and their right-wing allies, including Elon Musk, lied about this guidance, spread misinformation, accused me of doing things I didn't do or say, and fueled a fake controversy of their own creation. Now, I'm used to Republicans and the right wing lying about me. It comes with the job. But this time, these lies came at a cost. I haven't broken the law, I haven't committed a crime, and I've never encouraged or directed anyone to break any laws or commit any crimes. But when President Trump's hand-picked appointee, Tom Homan, was asked about me in this guidance after he apparently threatened to arrest elected officials across the country, he said, "Wait till you see what's coming. Wait till you see what's coming." Overnight, Republican lawmakers piled on, encouraging the Trump administration to arrest me. Showing threats like this should be of concern to every Wisconsinite and every American who cares about this country and the values held here. We live in the United States of America, folks. We are a country of laws. The rule of law matters. Following the law matters. In this country, the federal government doesn't get to abuse its power to threaten everyday Americans. In this country, the federal government doesn't get to arrest American citizens who have not committed a crime. In this country, we don't threaten to persecute people just because they belong to a different political party. These threats represent a concerning trajectory in this country. We now have a federal government that will threaten or arrest an elected official or even everyday American citizens who have broken no laws, committed no crimes, and done nothing wrong. And as disgusted as I am about the continued actions of the Trump administration, I'm not afraid. I've never once been discouraged from doing the right thing, and I will not start today.
Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers speaking in a video posted online Friday. This comes after the Trump administration escalated its attacks on judges and immigrants the week before, when FBI agents arrested Milwaukee, Wisconsin County Judge Hannah Dugan on charges of obstructing justice and concealing an immigrant from arrest as federal agents waited in the courthouse hallway. She opened a side door for the immigrant to pass out of. Meanwhile, in an interview on NBC's Meet the Press, President Trump says he doesn't know if he needs to uphold the Constitution or if people in the U.S. are entitled to due process rights. For more, we're joined in Superior, Wisconsin by Lisa Graves. She's the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States, now the director and founder of the policy research group True North Research and co-host of the podcast Legal AF. Her forthcoming book is titled Without Precedent: How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices rewrote the Constitution and dismantled our rights. We welcome you back to Democracy Now!, Lisa. Without precedent could also describe our president, Donald Trump. If you could first respond to this direct threat against the Wisconsin Governor, Tony Evers.
Well, it really is an outrageous act, this veiled threat against Governor Evers and any elected official in the United States. What Governor Evers did was issue guidance to consult lawyers. Of course, state and local officials have a right to consult lawyers when they encounter federal agents or local and state agents. And so it's really nothing abnormal at all that the governor did. And what's abnormal, what's outrageous, is the threats being made by this administration. In fact, what we're seeing, obviously, what we're witnessing is this escalation of attacks on pillars of civil society, as well as on the actual responsibilities under the Constitution that the president and senators and other officers take an oath to uphold.
So, do you see Wisconsin itself as a target? I mean, going back to Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson, Wisconsin often seen as a kind of model for the country. And do you see this as going back to retaliation for Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, complete defeat in Wisconsin over his support for the conservative judge that lost by not a few percentage points, shocking everyone, including, I think, the judge who won, the Democratic judge who won?
Well, that's right. Wisconsinites rejected this intervention, this extraordinary, unprecedented intervention by Elon Musk to basically try to buy a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court, while he also has litigation pending in the state of Wisconsin over his business. I think what we're seeing in a broader sense is just the absolute degradation of the rule of law. The Constitution requires that no person be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process of law means not whim, not caprice, not revenge, not retaliation for not being in the fan club of this president or the men that he has put into these roles in which they're engaging in such destruction, like Elon Musk. And we are, we have seen Wisconsin targeted in that way, obviously by Musk in this most recent Supreme Court race in which he was resoundingly defeated. But I think we're also seeing this broader attack, the governor of Maine, the governor of Wisconsin, other governors who dare to speak up, defend the rule of law, defend the rights and interests of their citizens, to access Social Security, to have their children registered, for example, in Social Security when they're born in the United States. We're seeing this assault on the idea, the promise, the demand, the requirement under the Constitution that the writ of habeas corpus not be suspended. That, by its definition, means that people, if they are seized, have a right to have an independent judicial tribunal assess whether there's evidence against them, assess whether they can be held and deprived of their liberty. But Trump and this administration has leveled an assault on that legal command that Donald Trump took an oath to uphold. I question whether that oath had any meaning anymore after John Roberts waved away the criminal liability of Donald Trump in that disastrous immunity decision last summer without precedent, like the title of my book, but that unprecedented decision to say the president is above the law, that he can break the law, rather than that he has a duty to faithfully uphold the law. That's what the Constitution requires of the president, that he faithfully execute the laws, and nothing could be more faithless than breaking those laws. Nothing could be more faithless than disregarding the command, the requirement of the Constitution of due process of law for all persons.
On Thursday, at a judges' conference in Puerto Rico, the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson appeared to forcefully rebuke President Trump and the administration's attack on judges it deems unfavorable to its agenda. She didn't call out Trump by name, but said she was addressing, quote, the elephant in the room. Justice Brown Jackson said, quote, the attacks are not random. They seem designed to intimidate those of us who serve in this critical capacity. The threats and harassment are attacks on our democracy, on our system of government, and they ultimately risk undermining our Constitution and the rule of law. Again, those are the words of a Supreme Court Justice, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Lisa Graves.
That's right. She's exactly right. We are seeing this assault on the independence of the judicial branch, on the separation of powers, on the notion that anyone can check the demands of this president, the idea that the president and his attorney general can just disregard longstanding laws, disregard precedents, and in fact, that they can decide not to follow the commands, the orders of courts, as we saw in the case of Judge Boasberg's order involving the Trump administration's attempts to basically evade the requirement of people getting due process in this country. So we are well into a constitutional crisis, not just because of the disobedience of court orders by Trump, but also by these attacks on judges for daring to do their job and enforce our laws and protect our rights, including that right to due process that everyone is entitled to, whether you're a citizen or immigrant in the United States. So we have a lot to do as citizens, as people in this country, to stand up, to speak out, and to not tolerate this outrageous disregard for the command of our Constitution to defend all of our rights against this authoritarian leadership that is expanding its efforts to control the American people.
So your book, Without Precedent, if you can just give us a sneak peek, it's dealing with the Chief Justice Roberts, who has, at some points now, sided with the liberal judges. But your subtitle, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. You're saying he really laid the groundwork here.
Yes, I am. In fact, I think even if he were to rule against Trump on more than a temporary basis on some of these orders, what John Roberts has done is usher in this new era. He basically signaled to the American people last summer that Trump could do no wrong, that he could not be held criminally liable for his actions, and that anything that constitutes an official act, a so-called official act, is immune from any criminal consequences or prosecution, both retrospectively and going forward. So John Roberts really paved the way for this authoritarian era we're in. He also did so by really systematically dismantling core voting rights protections in this country, along with other key rights. And so we have a situation where there is an apparent conflict in some ways between the Supreme Court right now and Donald Trump. But we've also seen John Roberts move heaven and earth basically to protect Donald Trump. So we'll see what John Roberts does in the coming weeks. But at the end of the day, John Roberts has laid the foundation for this authoritarianism, for this aggrandizement of presidential power, and for the degradation of fundamental liberties in this country, including key protections for voting rights, which were won through the blood, sweat, and tears of millions of Americans. John Roberts has dismantled key guardrails in our democracy.
And the Supreme Court ruling about facilitating the return of Kelmar Abrego Garcia, yet being extremely somewhat vague about it, and the fact that Trump has been defiant in saying no, what does that mean when it comes to executive power and judiciary power?
I was concerned about that language because even though on the surface that order seemed to command that the president take action and return this Maryland man to his home, it seemed as though it was not the strongest language that could be issued by this court. And Donald Trump has exploited that language to basically suggest that he can't do it, although he recently suggested that he could do it, he just won't do it. The fact is that this court needs to take robust action to defend the ordinary laws in this country and these norms that you just cannot ship someone out of this country, declare them a terrorist with no evidence to any independent judge to assess whether there's any validity to that. People have been removed from this country who have not been convicted of crimes, and notwithstanding the assertions of Donald Trump on that most recent interview that there are millions of murderers roaming the streets who are immigrants, that's not actually true. Many people who are convicted of crimes are serving sentences. At the end of those sentences, they are often deported. This is a fake crisis that he has basically tried to plant in people's minds in order to exercise extraordinary unconstitutional, anti-constitutional powers. And it is the duty of this Supreme Court, of our Supreme Court, to stand up for the rule of law, to stand up for the due process clause and the writ of habeas corpus and insist that it be followed. And I'm not sure that John Roberts, given his background, given his efforts to advance the Republican Party in numerous ways, will actually stand up, or whether he will stand with other Republican appointees to the Supreme Court and find technical ways for Donald Trump to get away with this assault on core principles of our democracy and our Constitution. And quite frankly, Amy, given the fact that John Roberts invented immunity for the president, criminal immunity for the president that has never existed in our constitutional history, to have this type of immunity, this broad immunity, I don't have confidence that that John Roberts and his fellow Republican appointees will correctly interpret the 14th Amendment when it comes to the rights of citizens, including American citizens born in this country. That is the first clause of the 14th Amendment. This court has veered away from the plain meaning of the Constitution, the plain language, when it suits them to aid Donald Trump. And we need to have a court, the American people deserve a court we can have confidence in, that won't play partisan politics, won't put its thumb on the scale of justice in favor of Donald Trump or any other president because of their party or their allegiance or alignment.
Lisa Graves, I want to thank you for being with us, director and founder of the policy research group True North Research, co-host of the podcast Legal AF. Her forthcoming book, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and His Accomplices Rewrote the Constitution and Dismantled Our Rights. Former Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States, speaking to us from Superior, Wisconsin. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Israeli military is calling up tens of thousands of reservists as Israel's security cabinet has unanimously approved plans to expand its assault on Gaza, where Israel's already killed at least 52,000 Palestinians over the past 18 months. That figure is believed to be a vast undercount. Israel's killed more than 2,400 Palestinians since it broke the ceasefire in mid-March. One Israeli official told CNN the new plan for Gaza involves, quote, the conquest of territory and remaining there, unquote. This comes as Israel's devastating blockade on all humanitarian and food aid has entered its third month. Health officials in Gaza say at least 57 Palestinians have already starved to death. According to UNICEF, more than 9,000 children have been admitted for treatment for acute malnutrition so far this year. Aid groups are blasting a new Israeli proposal to take control of aid distribution and put U.S. security contractors in charge. Jan Egeland of the Norwegian Refugee Council said, quote, they want to manipulate and militarize all aid to civilians, forcing us to deliver supplies through hubs designed by the Israeli military, unquote. Meanwhile, Israel continued to attack Palestinians across Gaza over the weekend. One strike at Khan Yunis killed newlyweds Ala Abu Al-Anin and Hala Zurab 1 day after their wedding. Survivors of the blast denounced the Israeli attack.
I
wish my voice could reach the whole world to tell them that we are oppressed. Our children die of hunger every day. They are torn apart in front of our eyes, and we cannot do anything.
In other news from Gaza, one of Pope Francis's Pope-mobiles is being turned into a mobile healthcare unit for children in Gaza. Pope Francis gave his blessing to the initiative just before his death. Tension is escalating between Israel and Yemen after a Houthi missile hit near Ben Gurion Airport outside Tel Aviv. The Houthis said it carried out the strike, quote, in rejection of Israel's crime of genocide, unquote. A Houthi military spokesperson vowed more attacks on Israel.
The Yemeni armed forces announced that they will work to impose a comprehensive air blockade on the Israeli enemy by repeatedly targeting airports, most notably Lod Airport, known in Israel as Ben Gurion Airport.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to respond to the Houthi attack and threatened Iran as well. Meanwhile, the U.S. is continuing to bomb Yemen on an almost daily basis. At least 16 people were injured in U.S. airstrikes overnight in the capital, Sana'a. In an interview on NBC's Meet the Press, President Trump said he does not know if he needs to uphold the Constitution. Trump made the comment when questioned by Kristen Welker.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Well, the Fifth Amendment says...
I don't know. It seems it might say that, but if you're talking about that, then we'd have to have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million trials. We have thousands of people that are some murderers and some drug dealers and some of the worst people on earth. Some of the worst, most dangerous people on earth. And I was elected to get them the hell out of here, and the courts are holding me from doing it.
But even given those numbers that you're talking about, don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know.
In immigration news, Wisconsin's Democratic governor, Tony Evers, is pushing back after Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, suggested he and other Wisconsin officials could be arrested over local immigration policies. Homan made the veiled threat when questioned last week by the far-right website Gateway Pundit.
Why not just arrest the leaders who are harboring and shielding illegal aliens, actually terrorists, from deportation?
Wait to see what's coming.
And, well, real quick, your comments on the Wisconsin governor sending directives to state agencies to not comply with ICE and actually stop your deportation efforts.
Wait to see what's coming.
Wait to see what's coming. Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers responded in this video posted online.
Overnight, Republican lawmakers piled on, encouraging the Trump administration to arrest me. Showing threats like this should be of concern to every Wisconsinite and every American who cares about this country and the values held here.
We'll have more on this story after headlines. We'll go to Wisconsin. In related news, the Justice Department has sued the city of Denver and the state of Colorado over their sanctuary laws, claiming they interfere with federal immigration enforcement. In other immigration news, the Trump administration's designated 2 Haitian gangs as terrorist groups. Many experts fear the move could deepen the humanitarian crisis in Haiti if aid groups pull back out of fear of being prosecuted for dealing with armed groups. President Trump says he's directing the Bureau of Prisons to reopen and enlarge Alcatraz, the infamous jail located on an island in the San Francisco Bay. The prison has been closed for over 60 years and is a popular tourist spot that makes tens of millions of dollars every year. Meanwhile, the White House has posted an AI image of Trump depicted as the Pope, prompting outrage. The New York State Catholic Conference of Bishops blasted the president, saying, quote, "We just buried our beloved Pope Francis, and the cardinals are about to enter a solemn conclave to elect a new successor of St. Peter. Do not mock us," they said. In more Trump news, the U.S. Army confirmed there will be a large military parade in Washington to mark the Army's 250th anniversary and the birthday of President Trump, his 79th birthday on June 14th. Some 6,600 soldiers are expected to take part, along with 150 military vehicles and 50 military aircraft. On Sunday, Trump also announced a new 100% tariff on foreign-made films, claiming that they pose a, quote, national security threat. The announcement came as a surprise to Hollywood studios. On Friday, the Trump administration filed an emergency appeal asking the Supreme Court to let members of Elon Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency access sensitive Social Security records of hundreds of millions of people. In March, one federal judge described DOJ's efforts as a fishing expedition that was, quote, in search of a fraud epidemic based on little more than suspicion, unquote. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has forcefully rejected President Trump's idea of sending U.S. troops into Mexico to combat drug cartels. On Saturday, she detailed a call she held with Trump last month.
In one of the calls, the U.S. President Donald Trump said it was important for the U.S. Army to enter Mexico to help us in the fight against drug trafficking. And I want to say that's true. In some of the calls, he said, quote, "How can we help you fight drug trafficking? I propose that the U.S. Army come in to help you." And you know what I told him? No, President Trump. The territory is sacrosanct. Sovereignty is sacrosanct. Sovereignty is not for sale. Sovereignty is loved and defended.
President Trump lashed out at President Sheinbaum, saying, quote, "She's so afraid of the cartel she can't even think straight," Trump said. In Sudan, the death toll in the city of Al-Hud has risen to 300 days after the paramilitary rapid support forces say they captured the key city in West Kordofan state, which borders Darfur. Among the 300 killed in the RSF attacks were at least 21 children. Separately on Sunday, RSF drone attacks struck a military port in the city of Port Sudan. It's the first direct attacks on the de facto capital of Sudan's military-led government since the devastating civil war broke out over 2 years ago. This all comes as the International Court of Justice is ruling today in Sudan's genocide case against the United Arab Emirates, which Sudan accuses of fueling the RSF. In South Sudan, at least 7 people were killed, including a 9-month-old baby, and another 20 were injured in bombings on a market in Panga County in the greater Upper Nile region. The group Doctors Without Borders said the explosions completely destroyed its pharmacy and damaged its hospital, the area's only hospital. The perpetrator has not been confirmed, but the deadly attack comes at a time of increasing conflict amidst fears of a new civil war in South Sudan after a power-sharing deal collapsed in March. In Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his ruling Labor Party will remain in power after defeating Conservative Peter Dutton of the Liberal Party in Saturday's national elections. Dutton's hardline immigration plans and criticism of China earned him comparisons to Trump by Australians, who cited the high cost of living as their top concern. Dutton was roundly rejected by voters Saturday and even lost his own seat, despite leading in the polls a few months ago. The victory for Australia's Labor Party comes a week after Canadians also rejected the Conservative challenger in national elections. Prime Minister Albanese delivered a victory speech in Sydney.
In this time of global uncertainty, Australians have chosen optimism and determination. Australians have chosen to face global challenges the Australian way, looking after each other while building for the future.
Earlier today, the Australian Prime Minister said he had a warm conversation with Trump on tariffs and the joint Australia, U.S., UK Defence Pact. In Romania, the hard-right nationalist pro-Trump politician George Simeon won the first round of presidential voting Sunday. He'll face Bucharest Mayor Nicolae Dan in a runoff on May 18th. The election comes 5 months after Romania's constitutional court annulled a presidential election won by the far-right ultra-nationalist Calin Georgescu, who was barred from running again after being charged with campaign violations and being involved with a fascist organization. Despite the charges, Simeon has vowed to give him a leadership post if he wins the runoff. An Illinois landlord who stormed the home of his tenants and fatally stabbed a 6-year-old Palestinian-American boy in October 2023 has been sentenced to 53 years in prison. In February, a jury had found Joseph Juba guilty of murder and hate crimes for killing Wadi al-Fayoum, who he stabbed 26 times. Ahmed Rahab, the executive director of CARE Chicago, said, quote, "No sentence can restore what was taken, but today's outcome delivers a necessary measure of justice. Wadi was an innocent child. He was targeted because of who he was, Muslim, Palestinian, and loved," he said. Questions are mounting about Pennsylvania Democratic Senator John Fetterman's ability to continue serving after recent reports that former and current staffers are increasingly concerned about his erratic behavior. Senator Fetterman, who had a stroke in 2022, had run as a progressive but has sharply shifted to the right. Last year, in May, his former chief of staff wrote a 1,600-word email to the medical director of the Traumatic Brain Injury and Psychiatry Unit at Walter Reed, expressing concern over Fetterman's mental health, including his, quote, conspiratorial thinking, megalomania, and rambling, unquote. New York Magazine reveals that in a private meeting in February, Senator Fetterman spoke against Israel's then ceasefire, saying, quote, "Let's get back to killing," unquote. During a discussion on Gaza and the Palestinians, he reportedly said, quote, "Kill them all," unquote. In February, The Intercept reported there had been an exodus from Fetterman's staff, in part due to his shift on Israel and his willingness to work with President Trump. Many of Fetterman's small donors have also asked for him to return their campaign donations to him. The world's richest man, Elon Musk, now has his own city. On Saturday, residents in South Texas voted to make the home of Musk's SpaceX rocket company its own city, called Starbase. It's located about 25 miles east of Brownsville. Most of the voters are believed to have been SpaceX employees. The South Texas Environmental Justice Network campaigned against Starbase becoming its own city, warning it could lead to more environmental damage to the area. In other news from Texas, Republican Governor Greg Abbott has signed the country's largest school voucher program into law, making Texas the 16th state to make taxpayer funds available to pay for private schools. So-called school choice is a Republican-push program which sucks money from budget-strapped public schools and largely benefits wealthier families. This comes as the conservative-led U.S. Supreme Court appears poised to allow publicly funded charter schools to start including religious schools. In more education news, the Justice Department last week terminated a half-century-old school desegregation order in Louisiana. The Plaquemines Parish School Board came under a federal consent decree in 1966 for refusing to comply with the landmark Brown v. Board decision outlawing segregation in schools. Trump's Department of Justice said it's, quote, correcting wrongs from the past. And in more related news, the Education Department has launched an investigation into a Chicago school program designed to help Black students. The federal agency said it could withhold federal funding from the district over the Black Student Success Plan, alleging it discriminates against non-Black students. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. Democracy depends on a free press. Please support our independent journalism at democracynow.org/give.
Secretary of State Marco Rubio warned the government will start aggressively revoking the visas of Chinese students, one day after the Trump administration announced it's halting the processing of visas for foreign students as it prepares to require additional social media vetting for every applicant. Rubio said students with links to the Chinese Communist Party, which is China's sole and ruling party, would be especially targeted, as well as people studying in, quote, critical fields. Chinese nationals represent the second largest proportion of overseas students in the U.S. Meanwhile, President Trump told reporters Wednesday Harvard should cap its acceptance of international students at around 15%. Last week, Trump revoked Harvard's certification for admitting overseas students. Currently, over a quarter of Harvard's student body is international. Many of those students are now seeking to transfer to another school. Harvard's commencement ceremonies are taking place today. This week, Harvard students protested in support of international students. This is Pakistani international student Abdullah Shahid Sal, who is also the student body co-president of Harvard's Undergraduate Association.
I haven't had the time yet to think about my backup plans, but as of now, I don't think anyone is sure if they can return for their fall semester back into Harvard and more broadly back into the U.S. In that case, I would have to look for other options. I haven't looked at the list yet for the next available ones because the most transfer windows for most colleges have already been closed. But I also want to make it very, very clear that